Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another Country Living Essentials. We're at number 8 today, so we've done 7 already. And I want to ask you, 4 years and 5 months ago, on the 27th of March 2020, South Africa announced and enforced a national lockdown. So almost 4.5 years have passed since then. And so what could have you done in those 4.5 years? Well, you could have got a diploma in something. You could have got a degree at a university. You could have started your own business. They say it takes 5 years. You could have built a house. The question is, what did you do since COVID? And I think these are questions we need to ask ourselves. And, you know, Jesus, when he's talking about the abomination of desolation in around Jerusalem, the city, when the Romans come and encamp there, he says that when you see this, do not go into your house, do not go down when you're in the field, don't leave your field and go and get your stuff, flee to the mountains. Now what's interesting is, almost 4 years, it's about 3.5 years before Titus comes back with the Roman army. And the question is, why does Jesus say, don't go down, if you're on the roof of your house, don't go down to your house. If you're in your field, don't go back to your house, flee. Why does Jesus say, when there's still 3.5 years to get out of Jerusalem, why does he say this? Because Jesus understands human nature. We procrastinate. It is a typical weakness we have as humans. We procrastinate, we put it off, we put it off. And what Jesus was saying is, there's no time to put this off. You know, what is the best time to plant a tree? Well, now. No, it's not. 20 years ago was the best time to plant a tree. But the fact is, we can't go back 20 years. You can't go back 4 years from COVID. So the best time to plant a tree is now. But it would have been better if you'd done it before. And I want to encourage you, for a lot of people are feeling like there's no time. Things are mounting, the signs are too far advanced, we don't have time to go into the country, we don't have time to prepare. And I want to tell you, you have today, you have tomorrow, prepare. There is time to get ready. God's people must prepare. COVID revealed a lot of flaws in modern society. We all were awakened to the fact that we are totally dependent, most of us, on the government for our most basic needs: water, food, sanitary, housing. And we know that a time is coming when the world, a global enforcement, is going to be enforced, where unless you follow the narrative of the day, the teaching of the day, you are not going to be eventually allowed to buy and sell. And so we need to prepare for that time. Our next talk will be by Dr. Geeta Odendaal. She is a functional medicine, so she's a medical doctor specializing in functional medicine with a strong emphasis on home remedies, natural remedies, and her mother is Madeleine van der Walt. Most of you will probably know her. She's an avid country living promoter. You've probably seen her in quite a lot of talks. And so she's going to be presenting a day. It's actually going to be a weekend on have we got the 16th and 17th of November. So diarize that. Bruce Webb will be doing a talk as well. Dr. Bruce Webb will also be talking. And so diarize that, but we will have a Country Living Essentials on the Sunday at 9 o'clock with a special emphasis on those of you who are doing country living, what you can do for natural remedies and how you can help yourself at home and not be dependent on the system. I was recently up at Muldersdrift for a camp meeting special focusing on country living and helping people to get into the country. And I attended a talk by Doe Kruger, who is a specialist in survival, and he trains the special forces in the military on survival. And he gave us a talk, and he brought out a point that was really sank home, and that was, he said, it doesn't matter how good you are. on survival. Doesn't matter how much training, how much you know. There are certain times of the year that it is almost impossible to survive in the bush. And the same thing goes for living out of your garden. There are certain times of the year that you will not be able to live out of your garden. And so today, Ravano is come to he's a food technologist. He's a specialized in thermal technology. He's also a packaging technologist. He's been in the industry for 24 years, and he's currently consulting to the food and beverage industry. And we are privileged to have him with us today. Last time he gave us a talk, he gave us a little bit of a scare and a reality check of the responsibility one needs to take when you are preserving food, that you can actually poison your family if you do not do it in the right way. And so, Ravano, we really appreciate you taking your professional time to come and share with us. And we look forward. We know it's going to be another exciting adventure. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, Michelle, is that okay? Does it sound good? And all you need to do is follow the recipe exactly as it is written, with no changes. But I'm going to show you a bit of the background of how those trusted, verified recipes get written. And then at the end, if we have any questions or comments, or maybe there's some products that you have canned at home and you've experienced some difficulty or some problems, what we're going to do, we are going to have some time for questions and answers where we will discuss those problems that you might have had. Thank you. So, just before we get started, I just want to turn the temperature down a bit. So just before we get started, just some points that we need to cover. Because we are doing carrots, carrots have a high pH, so the pH of carrots is more than 4.50. And as we discussed in part 1, that puts carrots in the category which we refer to as low acid. So this would be a low acid canned food, LACF for short. And because it's low acid and the pH is above 4.50, we cannot use a water boiler or a water bath. So we have to go to temperatures well above 100 degrees Celsius to render this product safe for consumption. So that's why we have the pressure canner here that we're going to be using this morning. And we don't have a water bath or a water boiler because those temperatures only go to 100 degrees Celsius. When you are canning carrots, it's advisable to use carrots which have a smaller diameter. The diameter should be around about 2.5 to 3 centimeters. The reason for this is when carrots are really big or have a very wide diameter, they are quite fibrous and it's not really optimal to use for canning. So you'd want to use a thinner diameter carrot. As we discussed in part 1, it's very important that you take your altitude where you are canning into account when you are setting up your canner for the temperature that you need. So a normal canner would run at around about 116 degrees Celsius in Cape Town. That same canner at the same pressure setting, if it were up at higher altitude, let's say you were in Johannesburg, for example, which is around about 1,700 meters above sea level, the temperature would be approximately 2 to 3 degrees lower. So that needs to be taken into account. So if you have a weighted pressure canner, there would be different weights that you could use on your canner, and you just need to make sure that you select the correct one according to the instructions of your canner. What we're going to do now, I'm going to start up the canner. We've already preheated it, so it shouldn't take too long. So you'll hear in the background that there will be some steam and there will be some water boiling. We want to get it up to temperature while we prepare the jars and the lids for the carrots. So the first thing that we're going to do while we wait, we are going to use hot water to preheat the lids. As we explained in part 1, the lids have a lining where it's going to make contact with the glass jar, and that lining, or compound as we refer to it, needs to be softened so that we can get a good seal. And the way we're going to soften it is by using hot water. Okay, so we're going to leave the lids there while we are getting everything ready so that compound can soften. Then we have our carrots, which have been pre-prepared. The carrots have been simply sliced, and you can determine how much you want to slice it. We are going to be checking to see what the heat penetration rates were today on the carrots that we are using. So the jars have all been pre-cleaned. We are going to do about 2 jars today. So the first step is to fill the carrots into the jar. Whichever recipe you are following, you will notice that in these recipes there are 2 methods. You can either have a hot pack, where the carrots are preheated in a brine or in a hot water solution and then added, or you can have a raw pack, which is what we're doing today, where the carrots are simply just added to the jar after slicing, and then the hot liquid would be poured over the carrots. So before we add the carrots to the second jar, I'm going to place the data logger in the center. And the data logger will be taking temperature readings inside of the carrot as it goes through the canning process. Okay. When doing canning, it's always important to remember that your headspace is important. So you always want to have about a 1 to 2 centimeter headspace so that your jar is not too full. I'm going to use hot water. Depending on the flavor profile you're trying to go for, you could use plain water. You could also add a little bit of salt to the water and make yourself a brine. That will also bring out the flavor of the produce that you are canning. So now we are pouring over the covering liquid. Okay, so our lids have been preheating to soften the compound. We're now going to remove it from the hot water. The compound should be fairly softened at this point. So we place the lids firmly down. Depending on what type of product you are canning, if it's a product that has particulates or a sauce, or where you could end up with a messy fill, if you do get any particulates on the rim of the jar, you can just use a damp cloth to wipe the rim clean. And then remember your lids that you are using, you can only use them once, so you cannot reuse them. The rings, however, you can reuse as long as they stay in good condition. So closing the jars is where a lot of your problems start. The jars are not to be closed too tight, and they also are not to be closed too lightly. So if you read your recipe or if you follow some home canning guidelines, often you will see that they refer to finger tight. So I'm going to demonstrate or show you what finger tight is. The best way to do finger tight is to only use 3 fingers, and you tighten it as tight as you can with 3 fingers, okay? And then that will take you to the point where the ring now makes contact with the top of the jar. Once you've made contact with the top of the jar, you can then turn it about a quarter turn, and not more than that. What this allows is, if there's excessive pressure that builds up inside of the jar, it will allow that pressure to escape, so that your lids don't buckle, and we'll talk about buckling later. And that is tight enough to, when the jar forms a vacuum, you will create a hermetic seal, and that's the term we use to describe an airtight seal. Okay, so we have our product. It's now sealed. It's ready to go into the canner. So our canner has been preheated. It's quite hot. You always need to be careful when you are working with a canner. Whenever you open the lid, try not to open the lid towards yourself, because then it means that the steam could go into your face and burn you. So always try and open the lid away from you so that the steam will go in the opposite direction. You need a good pair of heat-resistant and waterproof gloves. Make sure your gloves don't have any holes in it in case you stick your hand inside of the hot water. So we're going to open up the canner. The canner is currently at 97 degrees Celsius. Because we're doing pressure canning, you won't be able to build pressure unless you seal the canner off. So if you have a canner like mine, which has these petcocks, you will tighten them one opposite the other until they're all tightened. Okay, we'll know soon enough if we've tightened it well enough or not. Actually, we just want to do one more thing. Need to put our second data logger so we can track the temperature of the canner. Okay. So now my canner is closed, but you will notice that I have the valves open on top of the canner. And while these valves are open, the temperature won't rise much higher than 100 degrees Celsius here in Cape Town at sea level. And that is because it cannot build pressure because the pressure is now escaping through these valves. Now, this is an important part of the canning process. When you start up your canner, you need to leave the valves open on top of the canner, and this process we call venting. So the objective of venting is to remove all the air that is inside of the canner. You want the canner to be filled with what we call saturated steam, with no air pockets anywhere. If you have an air pocket creates an insulated area. So it won't get up to the temperature that it's required to get up to. So we're going to be going up to approximately 116 degrees Celsius today, which is the temperatures that normal home canners go up to. If you had an air pocket, the temperature in that air pocket could be as low as 107 or 108 degrees Celsius. So if you had any jars in that air pocket area, they would be underprocessed and potentially toxic. So the process that we follow is we wait 10 minutes before we close the vents and allow the canner to build further pressure. Okay. So we're going to just watch the clock, and when 10 minutes is over, we will close the valve. Yes. Question, yes?
Autoclave, steam pot, what's the difference?
Okay, very good question. Okay, so there are different pieces of equipment that all look like they do the same thing. So let's start off with your normal pressure cooker that you have at home that is used for cooking food. Some people would think that it is the same as a pressure canner that you use for canning, but it is not. So the temperature that you get up to in a pressure cooker that you'd use on your stove to cook vegetables or whatever else you would want to cook with it, is not suitable for canning, especially when we're doing low acid canned foods. Okay, the temperature is not as stable. It isn't controllable as you would control it on a home canner. You get two types of home canners, one with a gauge, as the one that we have, like the one that we have here, or you have the other types of home canners where it has a weight that you put on top of the vent valve. And that weight controls the pressure inside of the canner, which your pressure cooker, which you use for cooking food on the stove, does not have any of those features. So your temperature that you get to and the stability of maintaining that temperature is not very good. So they are not suitable for home canners. When it comes to things called autoclaves, autoclaves are very similar to what you see here. They are also very similar to home canning equipment. So if they have a gauge where you can control the pressure according to the set point pressure that's recommended in the recipe that you are using, then that is suitable for use. You just need to follow the manufacturer's instructions in terms of how much water goes into the canner that you are using, whether it's a home canner or an autoclave, so that you don't run out of water during the process. If you do, if it's an electric canner like this one, so this one has a built-in electric element, which is now heating the water. So if you did run out of water, you would burn the element out, and then you would have to replace that, which can be quite costly. The other thing also is if that happens during your process of canning, then the batch that you've manufactured or that you've made would not be suitable for use. You would either have to recan it on a canner that is properly functioning, or you'd have to refrigerate that product and consume it within a few days. Okay. Did I answer your question there? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so we've got 5 more minutes left of the venting. So let's quickly just run through some of the points that we didn't cover. So remember, as we discussed in part 1, hygiene is key. Okay, hygiene is one of the hurdles that you are using to preserve the food that you are making. It's not only the canning process and the heat that you're applying. So make sure that the produce that you are using to can is of an acceptable quality. If it doesn't look good enough to make a salad with it, then it's not good enough for canning. Okay? Sometimes there's a misconception that you can use slightly spoiled vegetables or things that are overripe, things that are damaged, but that is not true. You want your vegetables to be sound quality. Make sure that all the utensils that you are using, the surfaces, your hands, everything has been washed and sanitized, because you want to maintain strict hygiene for the preservation process. Then your packaging. If your jars have any cracks or chips, unfortunately you'll have to throw them out and you won't be able to use them. And then it's very important to have a close look at your ends that you are using. You want to make sure that there's no rust anywhere on the ends, and you want to be sure that the ends haven't been used before. So as soon as you open up your canned products to use them, don't keep the ends anywhere, rather throw them out. You only want to use them once. The reason for that is the compound in the canning process will take on the shape of the rim of the jar. And these jars do not have a perfectly flat surface. And that's why we have the compound that takes the shape of the surface and creates the seal that we need. So if I take a lid that's already been used, that means the compound has already been shaped to the jar that it was on previously. And I try and use it on a new jar, there's going to be imperfections in the seal, which means that you could have a lid that looks like it's sealed, but it's actually leaking. And then your product will spoil quite quickly. So always have a close look at your lids. The rings, these you can use over and over. So keep them in good condition. When you finish using them, rinse them, dry them, and keep them in a cool, dry area so that they don't get rusted. But this you can use over and over. Okay, and then we went through the finger tightening process. Was that clear for everybody? Yep. That's a very important part of the process. Sometimes, even if you do everything right, so here we're using quite a well-recognized brand of lids here in South Africa, but there are other kind of lids or cheaper brands or no-name brand lids that you could get at a lower price. You need to be careful. If you see those lids buckling in the process, even though you've closed it like we've described today, remember that a buckled lid means that the seal has been compromised. So if that happens, and if it didn't leak too badly, so meaning if the contents are still inside of the jar, you could still use that product immediately after canning, or refrigerate it and use it within a few days. But definitely don't store that product in your pantry for use later on. Okay, and then there's the rule that you will see most home canners, experienced home canners would tell you, or recipes or online training sessions that you might go on for home canning. We say, when in doubt, throw it out. Okay, so it's not worth it to get sick from something that you've canned. If something looks funny, or if you're not sure that that the product is safe, then rather just discard the product. You can always make more canned products again later. Okay, so we've just about reached the end of our 10 minutes. So what we are going to do now is we are going to close the vents, and we are going to see the pressure start to build. Okay. What we are going to do now the recipe would indicate what time you need to hold the product at the temperature that is specified. So we are going to 116 degrees Celsius today. Now, the question always comes out, when do you start timing this process time? So for carrots, we are going to hold the carrots now for 30 minutes. And when does that 30 minutes start? So the 30 minutes starts once you've reached the temperature set point, not once you've closed the vents. So I've closed the vents now, so the temperature is going to gradually increase above 100 degrees Celsius. So we can go above boiling point now because we are pressurizing our canner. So once we reach the set point temperature, that's when we start timing the 30 minutes. So I've got a temperature probe that's connected to this one that we're using for demonstration purposes today. So I'll be able to see on the digital display once we reach that temperature. If you're using your home canner, if you have a weighted home canner, that's the one where there's a little weight that you put on top of the canner. If you were using such a canner and if you were in Cape Town, if it's an American brand, you would have different size weights, and you would probably use a 11-pound weight to reach temperatures of about 116 degrees Celsius. The way you will know that you've reached that temperature is that the weight would start jiggling and bouncing around on top of the canner. If your canner is a stovetop canner, meaning it doesn't have an electric element and you're actually using your stove to generate the temperature, you will start with your stovetop on the maximum temperature, and once the weight starts to jiggle and to whistle, you would slowly decrease the temperature to stop the jiggling, but you don't want the jiggling to stop permanently because that means that you are now below your set point temperature. So the general rule is that you want it to still jiggle and bounce around maybe 3 to 4 times per minute. Then you know you are maintaining the temperature. If you are using a canner that has a gauge on it, you would then control your stovetop temperature until the gauge remains within a very, very small fluctuation around your set point temperature. That means you are maintaining your temperature correctly. Okay. Let's have a quick look at the gauge. Okay, we're going to monitor that to make sure we're building temperature. If it doesn't build temperature, if you have a problem that the gauge is not rising or the weight on top of your canner is not jiggling around, then it could be that your canner is not closed correctly. So then you just need to tighten your canner. Or if you have a canner that has a seal on the inside, you might need to look to see if your seal needs replacement. Okay, so let's quickly recap the process that we've gone through. So we've preheated the caps in hot water. You remember why we did that?
To let the seal expand.
Yeah, soften the compound. Okay, we want to soften the compound so that we can get a good seal on the jar. Very good. Then we said we need to ensure a clean surface on the top of the jar. We call that the finish or the rim. So you want to make sure you don't have any product in this area. Imagine you had a piece of food product over the rim, and now you've put your lid over it. You've gone through your canning process, and you've created a fairly good seal, but you still have a piece of food particle stuck there. What could happen with that piece of food particle? That could rot over time. And if it rots over time, then that means you've created a channel for air to now get inside of your jar. And it's not going to only be air, it's going to be bacteria as well, and then that jar will spoil. So that's why you don't want any food products on the rim of the jar. Okay, and then we finger tightened it. Remember the finger tightening process? So you'll use 3 fingers to turn the ring onto the jar until it makes contact. Okay, and then if you wanted to tighten it, you would just use 3 fingers. Or as soon as it makes contact, you will then judge just 1/4 turn further, and not further than that. And that's how tight the jars need to be. always remember, when you put your jars in the canner, there is some water that will escape in the form of steam. So that means that the water level will drop during the processing time that you are targeting. In this case, we are going for 30 minutes. So you need to make sure that you have enough water inside of the canner. The way my canner works, I need to have at least 3 or 4 centimeters worth of water above the level of the jars that we are processing. Okay, and then the first thing we did after we closed the lid, we left the vent valves open. You remember why we left the vent valves open?
Get rid of air pockets.
Air pockets, okay, because air is an insulator. So you need to make sure that you have no air inside of your canner while you are processing. So that's a very important step. We call that venting. And then once your 10 minutes has passed, you will close your vent valves, and then you will wait for your canner to reach the temperature that, according to your recipe that you are using. And the way that you will see that, if you're using a pressure gauge canner, you will wait until you reach the pressure set point according to your recipe. Or if you're using a weighted canner, you will wait until the weight starts to move around and steam starts to escape. So just to give you an indication, so now we are targeting 30 minutes at 116 degrees Celsius. So if you were using a gauge canner, your pressure gauge in Cape Town would read about 76 kPa pressure. Okay, that's 76 kPa pressure. But to achieve the same temperature in Johannesburg, you would have to go to a gauge pressure, if you were in Johannesburg, of about 97 kPa. Okay, so it's important to take your altitude into account when setting up your canner. Okay, so our canner is still going up to temperature. We're at about 110 degrees Celsius now. So later on, once the 30 minutes has passed, we're going to have to cool the containers. Now, the way that the containers are going to be cooled is we're simply going to switch off the heat source. So if we switch off the heat source, the temperature will gradually start to drop. It will drop very slowly. And also the temperature, the pressure will also drop together with the temperature. The reason why we want this to be a slow process is we want to maintain a positive pressure around the jar, because inside the jar, during the cooking process, there's a very high pressure that's built up inside of the jar. So the pressure in the canner is actually holding the lid down. If we had to just simply remove that pressure, then it means you have a high positive pressure with no external pressure around the jar, and then your lids would buckle. Okay, so you don't want to cool too quickly or release the pressure too quickly, because that would cause your lids to buckle. So the cooling process has to be a slow process, so don't rush that part of the canning process. Once your canner has depressurized totally, so that means your gauge has reached 0, or if you have a weighted pressure canner, you can remove the weight, and if you don't see any steam coming out, that means that there's no pressure left in the canner. If you get to that stage, you can then open the lid of the canner, and don't rush to take your jars out. It's always recommended to leave the jars in the water or in the canner for a further 10 minutes or so before you take it out, and then you will take it out, pack it on a table, maybe on a cloth, where you will leave it for maybe 12 hours or so to allow it to cool further naturally. Okay. What you will also notice while the jars are cooling is you would hear a pop sound, and that pop that you hear is the lids being depressed, and the reason it's depressed is because on the inside your internal pressures are now dropping, and they are dropping to below atmospheric pressure. So we're forming a vacuum inside of the jar, and the external pressure is pushing the lids down. And that gives you an indication that your lids have been sealed correctly, if you have that vacuum. If you are able to press the lid, if it's flipping in and out, that means that you did not achieve a correct seal, and that jar is not safe for you to store in your pantry. You would have to either discard it or refrigerate it and use it within a couple of days. Oh yes, also very important, once your jars have cooled and you've checked the seals, they all have vacuum, the lids are down, it's a good idea to have a permanent marker and mark your jars with the date that you produced it, and also you can put down what the product was if it's not obvious to see what it is that you've made. We always say as a rule of thumb that you can keep your home canned products for about 1 year, and then you know it's next season, so you should make fresh stock then. But try not to keep it for longer than 1 year. If you've followed the recipe and if your process was well controlled, there is no reason why your canned product shouldn't last more than 1 year. But the limiting factor is the packaging. So the glass jar is quite robust, that's why you can reuse your jars, but the ends might not be that robust. So after a while, these ends could start to rust or to pinhole, and that's why we say rather 12-month shelf life for your home canned product. Okay, is there any questions? No?
How long does it take to cool down in the, because obviously it's a fairly small container, you've got quite a lot of product. It must take quite long to get it all processed. So how long roughly would it lie in the pressure?
For the pressure to come down to zero? So it all depends on what product you are making, so that determines what temperature you're going to go to. So the higher the temperature or the higher the pressure that you've gone to, the longer the cooling process is going to be. Also, depending on how much jars you have inside. So if your canner is full, it will take longer to cool. If you only canned half the capacity, it might be quicker. But you're looking at roughly maybe half an hour to 45 minutes for it to cool. And in a lot of recipes, that cooling time is quite important because the institution or the organization who put that verified recipe together, oftentimes they take part of that cooling process to achieve your lethality or to make sure that you've killed all the bacteria. So if you had to cool it down too quickly, that means the temperature drops earlier inside of your container, which means that there's less bacteria that you would have killed. So when the process is calculated to be safe, when they say carrots can be processed at 11 psi or 116 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes at sea level, they are taking into account. Take a short break, and then we will come back in a few minutes, and then we will carry on with. Okay, welcome back. Our canner is running optimally. We are now at 116 degrees Celsius for the past few minutes. So there's about 25 more minutes left of processing before we start the cooling process. So let's just go through another few points while the canner is running, things that you need to look out for. You need to make sure that your heat source is regulated to make sure that you maintain the right temperature. So if you're using a stovetop, you need to make sure that you keep a close eye on it, that you don't leave your canner alone for long periods of time, especially in the beginning part of the process where you are fine-tuning the set point on your stove to maintain the temperature inside of your canner. So that means to maintain your pressure gauge at the pressure that was indicated on the recipe, or if you're using a weighted pressure canner, to maintain that jiggling of the weight, say 3 to 4 times per minute. So you need to keep a close eye on it. If you do experience a temperature drop during the canning process, for some reason, maybe you're using a gas stove and your gas bottle ran empty, and you didn't catch it in time, and for a few minutes or for 10 or 15 minutes, your canner did not have a heat source and the temperature dropped. The way that you would correct that is to get back up to temperature and to restart your timer. So you time from the beginning again. So even though 15 minutes might have passed already, you go back to 0 and you time your, for example, if it was the carrots that we were doing, you'd start your 30 minutes from the beginning again. That does mean that your carrots won't be as crunchy. It might be a little bit caramelized because of the high temperature exposure. But the main objective of canning is to produce a safe product that is safe for consumption. And that's why it's recommended to restart the timer. So also remember, when you get to the end of the process and you stop the heating and you allow the canner to gradually cool and the pressure to gradually drop, once you're ready to open the lid, it's important, as I said in the beginning, to open the lid with the lid facing away from you. There's going to be very hot vapors coming out of the canner. The water is going to still be close to 100 degrees Celsius, so there will be a lot of hot vapors and you don't want to burn. It's good to invest in a pair of heat-resistant, water-resistant gloves. You know, these you can use, these little home gloves that you use in your oven. These you can use while you're working with the jars on the table maybe, or maybe after it's out of the autoclave, but these are not waterproof. So if it gets wet, you're going to burn quite badly with these gloves.
Ravano, so if you can and you've got your carrots cut up, now obviously there's a limit to what you can put in your pressure cooker.
Yeah.
So you've maybe cut up 5 bowls of carrots, and the one set of carrots are going to be standing there waiting maybe an hour and a half before you can can them, or maybe you've done a bigger batch and it might be a few hours. Is that a problem? Should you?
Okay, good. Thank you for that question. That's a good question. So as we mentioned in part 1, this moment you cut your produce open, so in this case carrots, the moment you cut the carrot, the enzymes start to work, okay? And the enzymes are going to start to degrade that carrot. So if you are making a large batch and it's going to take you an hour or 2 to get everything in the jars, it's advisable that you then first blanch the carrots. So after you've cut it, you'll dip it in boiling water for maybe 3 or 4 minutes and take it out. What that will do is that will deactivate the enzymes. If the viewers want to go back to part 1, you will see the little experiment we did with the carrots in part 1, where we had carrots that was grated and put into a glass container, and we had carrots that was put into hot water for a few minutes, and then we checked the enzyme activity with hydrogen peroxide. And you could very clearly see that the carrots that went through the heating process had all the enzymes deactivated and there was no enzymatic activity. So if you're going to take, let's say, an hour or 2 to get all your carrots inside the jars and into the canner, then maybe first blanch the carrots straight after you've prepared all of them, and then they can sit for an hour or 2. I would not advise that it sits for much longer than that, because although you've deactivated the enzymes, there's still bacteria that you need to worry about. And although you are working hygienically, although your utensils are clean, although your surfaces are clean and your hands are clean, inevitably from the environment there will be a certain level of contamination, and your carrots could go sour if you keep them for a long time. So I would say that you then need to plan your preparation. So you'd plan how much you're going to do. Most of the trusted verified recipes, they will give you quantities that you need to prepare and how many jars you're going to get out. So they give you that indication. So you could then plan how much kilograms of carrots you're going to prepare for the number of jars that you want to fill. And then you can work it out in batches that fits inside of your canner that you have.
Can you only put one layer of cans?
No, so all canners, the manufacturer will tell you how much jars of different size jars. So these are the pints. You get quarts as well. So this is roughly about 500 ml. The larger jars is roughly about a liter. And they will tell you how many jars you can put inside. And usually, you can double stack your jars. So you can fill your canner with as much jars that can fit inside there. Sometimes it's maybe 7 jars on the bottom layer and another 7 jars on the second layer, as long as your lid can close. Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay. Okay, and then if you follow your recipe will also advise you to, once you've opened the pressure canner and you've taken your jars out, you will pack them on a tabletop, maybe on a cloth, and you won't pack them tightly together. Remember, you want them to cool, so you're going to pack them with gaps in between so that you can have airflow to allow your jars to cool. And your recipe would tell you to leave them for 12 to 24 hours. Yes.
We can, as ladies, where can we buy this little things that you put in there and the temperature?
Yeah, temperature data loggers.
Buy those?
Okay, so these are all imported. They're quite expensive. They range from each maybe between 18,000 rand up to about 45,000 rand each. So these are more industrial equipment that people will use where they are using it every day in their work that they are doing. So for you to purchase it for home use normally is not really financially viable because they're so expensive. But all the trusted verified recipes that you will follow, whoever wrote that recipe and published it, that's why it's good to make sure that you use a reliable source for your recipes. They would have already completed all these tests that I'm doing here today. So you can then trust that recipe. All you need to do is follow the instructions very carefully. Yes?
Do you have any recommended sources of recipes that we could?
Yes. So if you go on the internet, there's going to be many, many different sources. The ones that I would recommend is the ones that are normally backed by a particular government. So it could be a government website or a well-known or recognized university that will publish such data. So I'm going to just quickly run a search and I'll tell you. Oopsie. So there's one particular site, which is the University of Georgia, where they have quite extensive home canning information that you can download or you can read online. They have many recipes, so they've got recipes for fermenting, for pickling, for water bath canning, as well as for pressure canning, for fruits, for vegetables, and many other products. Michelle, with the website links, are we going to put it in the video later? Yes. So if you want the exact link, we will put it in the comments, in the description, and I'll give you 2 or 3 that I think is quite reliable. Okay. Okay, we still have 15 minutes of processing left. I want to go through a few of the problems that you might experience during canning or even after canning. So let's say maybe you walk through your pantry and you're admiring all your many jars that you've canned. There's certain things that you need to look out for. You need to look for any significant changes that have happened to the products that you've canned. The appearance must not change too drastically to what it was when it came out of your canner. So if there's excessive discoloring, that's an indication that something's gone wrong. Or if you see bubbling, so you see lots of bubbles inside of the container, maybe there's some foam that appears inside of the container. These are usually telltale signs of bacterial growth. So when bacteria grow, many times they produce gas, and this will show up as bubbles in the container. What will also happen over time, if there's bacteria growing inside of your jar, it will start to build pressure inside of the jar. So where your jar started off being with it deflected in the down position, showing that there's a vacuum, slowly that vacuum will be lost. It will turn into what we call a flipper. A flipper means you can click it in and out. And then as the bacteria grows further, the pressure will become quite excessive on the inside, and you won't be able to press the lid down because of the excessive pressure on the inside. And later on, you might even start to see the lid buckling. So the pressure is so high on the inside that it actually distorts the entire lid. And eventually it can explode, which means you'll have a really huge mess in your pantry, and it might not smell that pleasant. So that will be bacterial growth. If you see any signs of it, even if it's early on, rather throw it out. Don't use that, because it could be potentially harmful for you.
Just a question. I know lots of people say that, the canned goods, they can give it to their pets if it's not good or whatever. That's a no-no.
No, that's not true. So the organism that we spoke about last time, and we're going to speak about it again today, that would actually kill your pet as well. So you wouldn't want to do that. It is not safe for consumption. So in the industry, in the food industry, if we had any stock produced by a factory that was potentially harmful, then that particular manufacturer of the food actually has a responsibility in disposing of that product correctly to make sure that nobody actually has access to that stock. So that manufacturer wouldn't even simply be able to throw it in the garbage bin and let a garbage truck come and collect it. That would not be responsible disposal. So what we do in the industry, we would actually contract a waste company, and you sign a contract with them, agreeing how they're going to dispose of it. And if stock is potentially harmful, it has to be crushed and buried, so that nobody can go and dig it up in a landfill site somewhere.
So what is the story with, we're all trying to save money here and there. So you've got these places like foodies and looters and what have you, they've got expired goods. Is that actually good?
Okay, that's a tricky one. So doesn't matter who the place is that's selling it. So you get best before dates and you get expiry dates. So often with any best before date, there is a sort of a level of safety beyond that date, before something actually expires and becomes unacceptable. So in some cases, it might be safe to consume things that are beyond the best before date, but in other cases not. So let's think about the things that can go wrong with produce beyond its expiry date. So if we take home canning, for example, your limitation is on your metal closure. Your metal closure cannot last beyond a certain time period because your product is continually interacting with, as we described in part 1, you've got the compound over there that's sealing it, and then the surface here you can see has a sort of a paint on it. So we call that a lacquer coating or coating. So that coating is to prevent contact of the food product with the metal surface that's behind. So this metal surface is actually a few different metals put together. So in the center or in the middle, you'll have an iron layer, and then that iron is actually coated with tin. So it has a tin coating this side and a tin coating on the inside. And tin will actually interact with your product. The purpose of the tin is to protect the iron layer. The iron layer will rust and corrode very quickly. But the tin acts as a protective layer. But what happens with the tin, it actually dissolves into the food. But once the tin has totally dissolved, then the iron is exposed, and then it will start to rust. And then it creates what we call a pinhole, So if you've seen rusty cars, after a while you can put your finger through the rust because it actually makes holes through the metal. So the same thing will happen here, and as soon as that happens, then you lose your hermetic seal, so you no longer have an airtight seal, and you potentially have air and bacteria that have now gone into the container. So with metal packaging, although there might not be a microbial risk beyond the shelf life, there could be a heavy metal risk. So when we do, and we also do it at my company, when we do shelf life analysis for clients, especially if there's metal packaging involved, then we're not only checking to see that the product is acceptable from a flavor and a texture and a color perspective and from a microbial perspective, but we're also looking at it from a chemical perspective. So in most countries, metals are not good for you to consume, and in most countries around the world, they will have legislation that stipulates what is the maximum heavy metal amount that you can have in a food product. So for tin, for example, it will be approximately 200 ppm. And once you've reached or come close to 200 ppm, that's the end of the shelf life of the product. Even though it still looks good, it still tastes good, it still smells good, there's no bacteria, but the heavy metal content is now too much. So it can get very technical, and we will have to discuss each product and its attributes and how it spoils over time. So the short answer is, it's best not to consume products that is beyond the expiry date. If you have the product in your home and it's a long shelf life product, so I'm talking about a shelf stable product, not something that you have to refrigerate to keep safe. So let's say it's something that had a year shelf life or 18 months or 24 months, and you forgot about it and you found it a month after the expiry date, chances are it's probably going to be safe for you to consume. But from a technical perspective, we will have to evaluate each product on its own to determine what is the limiting factor, and is it something that you as the consumer will be able to notice, or is it something that we will only be able to pick up with chemical analysis. So heavy metal contamination, you might pick up a slight metallic taste, but you might not. But then you're getting in relatively high levels of tin into your body, which is not good.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a funny question. When I was growing up, my great-grandmother taught me that tins that fall, when you're shopping, don't buy them. Why?
Okay. Your grandmother was wise. So if you look at a tinned product or a canned product, or tin can, you will see that there's different kind of tins. You get what we call 3-piece cans. So that's where you will see it has a seam on the top. So you can see the metal has been bent and squashed together to get the lid onto the can. And if you look at the bottom, you will see there's another lid. So it actually has 2 lids, and then you have the body. So that we call a 3-piece can. And then you get other cans, which is a 2-piece can. You will see the bottom is molded, and so there's nothing that's been seamed together there, and there's only an end on the top. So let's say a can falls in the shop, and it lands on one of these seams. That seam can become compromised. So then that seam could leak, and it could suck in air and bacteria into the can. Okay, so that's the one reason. So that's if the seam is damaged. If the body of the can is damaged, so let's say there's a dent. If it's a minor dent, like, it's a really small dent, chances are it's probably going to be okay. But if the dent is significant enough, you must remember the tin plate that we use for canning is very thin. Nowadays, you're probably looking at 0.155 millimeters thick. So it's really, really thin. So if there is a significant dent which caused the metal to bend, or the tin plate to bend, it could become fractured. And then you will have what we call a pinhole leak, and the can be compromised. The problem with pinholes is, when I say a pinhole, so I'm talking about a microscopic hole, a few microns in diameter, maybe 20 or 30 micron wide, which is really, really small. So what happens in a case like that? It will suck in air and bacteria from the environment, but the hole is so small that even a food particle, like a little grain from tomato juice will be big enough to plug the hole again. So now the hole reseals itself. But you've got bacteria inside of the can, and that bacteria can then start to spoil the product. And you do get certain bacteria, as we described in part 1 of the talk, where they don't produce gas, where their toxins are colorless and odorless, have no flavor. So you as the consumer might not know that that product is spoiled. So dented cans, I would rather stay away from it, especially if the dent is significant or if the dent is on the seam, either the top seam or the bottom seam. Okay. So we've discussed bubbling during storage. We've also discussed bulging or buckling of the lids. So it will start off bulging. We call that swelling or soft swelling. Eventually it will become quite significant. We call that hard swelling. That's now a lot of gas production inside of the container by the bacteria. And after hard swelling, it will become buckled. And shortly after buckling, the lid could pop off the container. Hopefully you find it before that point. Then another thing that you could also come across is the nice thing about doing home canning using these jars, you can see the product on the inside. So let's say you can carrots, and you know carrots are a nice bright orange color. And inside between the carrots you start seeing maybe a little black or green, dark green mass starting to form and starting to grow like a little slime blob over there. That's also an indication of microbial growth. Usually that's either maybe mold that's starting to grow. If you see things like that, discard the entire contents of the jar. Don't just take the mass out and use the rest. That is a sign of spoilage, so rather don't consume your product. Is there any other strange things you might have maybe come across on your canned products where you were wondering whether it was safe or not? No?
Olives.
Olives, yes.
They tend to put a film at the top.
Like a white layer.
Yeah. Maybe if you could maybe just comment, because I know often you can just scoop that off, but maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so olives is normally a fermentation process that we use when we're producing olives. So if you look at the whole olive process, you start by harvesting the olives, you wash it, and then you maybe have it soaking in a liquid, which you change quite often. That first part is normally what we call a debittering process to get rid of the bitter flavors in the olives. And then after that, you will put it in maybe like a salt solution or salt water. And that's the beginning of the fermentation step. So what's happening when you put it in a salt environment, the salt is reducing the water activity. For those watching, in part 1, we described water activity. So basically, you're binding the moisture that's available in the olives. And what that does is certain bacteria will need moisture to grow. But now, because you're using the salt, you're canceling out a large spectrum of bacteria, and you're stopping them from growing because you're binding the water. But what you are doing, you are selecting the bacteria that you want to grow for your fermentation process. So in olives, it's usually a lactobacillus fermentation. So the bacteria is called lactobacillus. It's part of a group of bacteria that we call the lactic acid bacteria. And they are actually quite good bacteria. So they are what we call probiotics. They are good for you. They will not make you sick. If you had to go buy probiotics at the chemist, normally some of them will be lactic acid bacteria as well. So really not harmful. So that is the bacteria that's growing in your fermentation process of the olives. If it does not stop growing, usually lactobacillus forms what we call white colonies. So if they grow in groups, if I had to grow it in the lab, it would make a little colony. So that a colony is billions of bacteria grouped together growing in the same spot. And usually that would be white. So the white layer that you're seeing most likely is lactobacillus. So it's good bacteria that you're wiping off. You don't want to have huge numbers of bacteria, even good bacteria, in your system. So you wouldn't want to consume that now just because it's good bacteria. But if it's lactic acid bacteria or lactobacillus, you could scoop it off and then make use of the rest of the product.
So is as long as it's white, but if it's green, it gets like a mold on top, then that's a no.
No, that's a no-no, yes. Yeah, mold, they produce toxins,
Yeah.
so you don't want to consume that then. Then you would discard that bucket, or you wouldn't just discard the top, you'd discard everything. Our 30 minutes has expired, so before we go on with the rest of our talk, I'm going to switch the temperature off. And we're going to allow it to gradually cool. And we'll monitor the temperature on the display over here. Okay, any other strange things you might have noticed on your home canning? No? We'll move on. Okay, so just to give you a bit of insight into what we're going to do, with the temperature data loggers that we've put inside the carrot and inside the pressure canner to measure the pressure canner temperature, we are going to collect temperature information. We're going to make use of this formula here with certain reference temperatures and Z values for the particular organism that we're targeting. And then I'm going to calculate if we've achieved a sufficient kill using this 30 minutes at 116 degrees Celsius. Like I said earlier, this is something you don't have to do. I'm just giving you some insight into what happens when a recipe is being developed. So let us quickly recap what we discussed in terms of heat treatment in part 1. So when we treat something with heat, the main thing that happens is we are killing bacteria. So we're reducing the microbial load. That is the objective of the process. What also happens is we inactivate enzymes, like we discussed earlier. If you're going to prepare large batches of raw material that's going to sit for an hour or two, you might want to blanch it first to inactivate the enzymes. It's also important to remember that when we add heat or when we use heat to preserve foods, we do change the color, we change the flavor, and we change the texture. So, you know, there's no point in producing something that doesn't taste good or look good or smell good, because then nobody's going to want to eat it later. So you need to follow your recipe, stick to the holding times, stick to the temperatures that is stipulated, and you don't want to have any excessive exposure to high temperature. So for example, if you're blanching your carrots, after the 3 or 4 minutes blanching process, you want to take it out of the hot water to allow it to cool. If you had to leave it there longer, it's going to soften quite a bit, and maybe at the end of your canning process, you're not going to have sliced carrots, you might have carrot soup instead of sliced carrots, which is not going to be enjoyable. So remember that there are changes that takes place. For different kinds of products, if you follow your trusted verified recipes, certain products you can simply just hot fill. So that means you can cook it up in a pot, you can fill it straight from the pot while it's maybe close to boiling point. You can fill it into the container, close the container, invert the container, and that would be enough to produce a safe product. But other products maybe need more than that. Maybe you need to pasteurize it. And as we discussed in part 1, if the product has a certain level of acid which takes it to a pH below 4.50, then you do not need to use a pressure canner, and pasteurization is sufficient. So you could use a water bath process or a water boiling kind of process to produce a safe product. But if your product has a pH of above 4.50, like the carrots that we are doing today, then you need to use a sterilization process where we go well above 100 degrees Celsius. Okay. So the temperature is dropping. We're now at 114 degrees Celsius. Okay, and then just to recap on the organism. So with carrots, because it's a low acid canned food, the organism that we are targeting here is Clostridium botulinum, something you might have heard about if you're doing home canning. The illness is called botulism. So this is what we call a gram-positive organism. Gram-positive just means it has a very thick cell wall. It forms spores. which means even though you kill the bacteria can die at a relatively low temperature. But even if the bacteria is killed, there's a little spore inside the bacteria. An easy way to remember what this is to think of a seed. So although the bacteria dies, the seed stays behind, and that seed can always germinate and start to grow again into bacteria. So these bacteria grow at a pH of above 4.5, 4.50. So anything that is what we consider low acid canned foods is going to be at risk for Clostridium botulinum. The spores are extremely heat resistant, and in theory, and if you look at some textbooks with regards to how to kill this organism, you will see these numbers, 250 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 minutes. Or if it's a South African or a UK or British textbook, it might say 121.1 degrees Celsius for 3 minutes. So that is the theory that we use to produce a safe product. The 121 degrees Celsius, 121.1 degrees Celsius for 3 minutes is to achieve what we call a 12 log reduction, which is what I'm going to calculate using the data logger information for Clostridium botulinum. So we want to make sure that we've inactivated this organism because the illness that it causes is quite nasty. It produces a neurotoxin. The neurotoxin, once ingested, will get into your bloodstream. Your body will trigger an immune response, which will start off with vomiting and diarrhea. But once it's in your bloodstream, unfortunately, it will travel to different parts of your body. The first part that it travels to is the muscles that you use to talk, which means you start slurring your words, so you can't speak properly because those muscles are starting to become paralyzed. Then your vision becomes quite blurry because the muscles you use to focus your eyes will start to become paralyzed. And eventually, it will paralyze the muscles around your lungs that you use to breathe, and then you will suffocate to death. So the toxin that this organism produces is the most deadly substance that we know of on planet Earth. And unfortunately, it does not produce gas, so your container won't bulge, it won't buckle, it won't form any bubbles, you won't see it there, and the toxin is colorless and odorless. Okay. So I showed this in part 1, the statistics. This is a real threat, it does happen. But if we follow trusted, verified recipes, and if we don't make any changes to it, and we monitor our process as we explained today, and also in part 1, you will produce a safe product that you'll have absolutely nothing to worry about. So on this graph, the orange parts of the bar diagram, those are Clostridium cases which was recorded from home prepared, home canned kinds of products. Okay, so just to clarify, that 121.1 degrees Celsius for 3 minutes, that is not the canner time and temperature. That is the temperature inside the coldest point of the biggest food particle inside of the jar that you are processing. Okay, so that's why you need these temperature data loggers to try and determine the cooking times, because that's the point that we're targeting. If you just think about it, although the canner is hot, that heat still needs to travel through the glass jar, through the liquid, to each component inside of the glass jar. So I will show you the graph later, and you'll be able to see how the temperature of the canner goes up quite quickly, but the temperature inside the container is going to be a slow process to get up to temperature. So we'll be calculating the equivalent to reach 121.1 for 3 minutes. So whenever you're working with a product that has a pH of above 4.50, a low acid food, and you want to preserve it in a closed container, canning or home canning process will be the safest way to do that. You could also look at other kinds of processes like refrigeration or freezing, which we are not covering here today, but usually you will have a very short shelf life. So if you have a refrigerated process, the product would only be safe for about 10 days in the fridge. If you had to freeze it, it could last a little bit longer. If you wanted to keep it in the fridge for a longer period of time, then that product would also have to go through a thermal process. And the general time and temperature for such a product would be above 90 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes, and then rapid cooling and refrigeration below 8 degrees Celsius. The reason why we say below 8 degrees Celsius is because Clostridium botulinum, there are different types of Clostridium botulinum. There's one that will even grow in your fridge. So it will grow below, right down to about 3 degrees Celsius, which is your temperature in your fridge will fluctuate up to 7 or 8 degrees Celsius. So there's a type of Clostridium botulinum that will grow at very low temperatures, but fortunately for us, that type of Clostridium botulinum is inactivated 90 degrees for 10 minutes. So if you had to simmer the product close to boiling point for about 10 minutes, then you know you're well above 90 degrees Celsius, you'll inactivate that kind of Clostridium botulinum. But we're not covering that today. We're covering home canning, so we're doing pressure cooking. And then just also to recap, let's say you were doing home canning on a fruit product. So let's say you're doing peaches or pears, or you're doing a tomato product, maybe chopped tomato, whole tomato, tomato puree. Now these are not low acid foods. These foods contain a significant amount of acid, so their pHs are below 4.50. And even though their pHs are below 4.50, if you follow a trusted recipe, it will indicate on the recipe to add lemon juice as a safety precaution, or to add citric acid. So citric acid, it's commercially available. You can buy it in the shop. It's this white powder, very easy to work with. And it will tell you how much to add, even though the product is low pH. And the reason for that is some of these products, pears, peaches, but especially tomatoes, as we've seen in part 1, where we tested some tomato products where the pH was actually above 4.50. So just to be sure that the pH stays below 4.50, you would have to make use of either lemon juice or citric acid. The organism we're targeting there is not Clostridium botulinum, but it's either Clostridium paschuranum or Butyricum. These group of organisms we call the butyric anaerobes, and you can see that they die at a much lower temperature compared to Clostridium botulinum. So here we only have to heat the core up to a temperature of 93.3 degrees Celsius for about 5 minutes, and that's why we are able to pasteurize products in a normal boiling water environment when the pH is below 4.50. Okay, welcome back. We're just about ready to open the canner. It's completed its depressurization. The pressure is now at 0. The temperature has dropped nicely below 100. We're at 95, so we're ready to open. Just before we do that, I would just like to remind you of what we discussed in part 1 when it comes to glass. So transparent glass is what we call flint glass, and this has certain properties. And this will help you to understand why we go through the gentle cooling process. So one of the properties of flint glass is that thermal shock occurs with a delta T, which means a temperature change of 45 degrees Celsius or more. So what that means is, if the jar is at 116 degrees Celsius, which it was inside of the pressure canner, and if it had to come into contact with water or with a temperature that is more than 45 degrees Celsius away from 116, which is roughly, let's say, 70 degrees. So if I had to take it out the canner and put it in water that was colder than 70 degrees Celsius, we would experience thermal shock. So thermal shock is when the stresses in the wall of the glass is so much that it actually shatters. So the glass will actually burst. I'm sure you might have experienced it if you've taken something from a hot environment and put it in cold water and it just immediately shatters. So we don't want that to happen, and that's why we go through a gradual cooling process. We've discussed the lids and the sealing compound, and because we're using metal closures, this is why the shelf life is limited. Although it has a coating to protect the metal, over time the coating could lose its effectiveness. Your product can make contact with the tin layer, which will slowly dissolve the tin into your product, and eventually when that thin tin layer, normally on these tin plate that they use to make these ends, it only has a single coating of tin on either side, so that tin will become depleted quite quickly. Then your product makes contact with the iron layer, and then rusting and corrosion will occur where you can have a pinhole. So that's why we say keep your home can jars for about 12 months and not longer than that. Okay, so let's open the pressure canner and take out the jars. Okay, so we're going to allow them to cool further over there. And this is our temperature data logger that we put in to monitor the temperature of the pressure canner. So we're going to download this information. And then we also had a logger in this jar, which is measuring the temperature inside of the carrot, which is right in the geometric center of the container. And we're going to see what the heat penetration rate was over there. So I'm going to start by so the pop you heard, that is the vacuum forming, and we are now we have an hermetic seal on that container.
I noticed that with that canning, so is that done now? That's ready to go on your shelf?
No, so it will have to cool now for 12 to 24 hours, and when it's totally cooled down, it would then be ready to go into your pantry.
But now I noticed that in these carrots, there was no like salt put in or citric acid or whatever.
Yes.
So it's fine like that?
Yes. So as we said earlier, this is a low acid canned food.
Okay.
So because it's low acid canned food, we need to go to a high temperature to deactivate Clostridium botulinum. That's why we use the pressure canner, which goes to 116. If this was like a tomato product, for example, which is not a low acid food, but it's a acidic food which you can pasteurize. And if we were going to pasteurize it, then we would have had to add a little bit of lemon juice or citric acid to make sure that the pH is below 4.50. But this product's pH is above 4.50, so we're processing it as a low acid canned food. So we don't need to add any acid. Salt is only added for flavor, so you could add salt if you wanted to. Okay?
So only for flavor, not for preservation?
Not in this case, no. So the only time salt becomes a preserving tool is where you add quite large quantities of it. So let's say in excess of 5% salt, or more for that matter. Okay, so we've downloaded the data. I just want to show you what the graph looks like so you can see what happened with the temperature. So once your jars have gone through the cooling process, you've let it rest for 12 to 24 hours, you can remove the rings. It's actually recommended to remove the rings, and then you store the jars without the rings. Okay? So the lid is being kept on by the pressure difference. So there's a vacuum on the inside, and we have air pressure on the outside. So normal air pressure in Cape Town is 101 kPa. So we've got 101 kPa pressing it down. So the lid won't come off unless you physically remove it. So this is how we store our canned product. Okay. So when the team is ready, we'll put the data on the screen, and then we can quickly have a look.
Can I ask the question?
Yes, you may go ahead.
You were saying things that we've seen, funny things we've seen on canned products.
Yeah.
Now, I know when my parents used to can, my dad often tried to, not make the product too sugary. And then you'd open the product and there would be like a mold or stuff on there. And I remember he would scoop it off and then he would eat it, but no one else in the family would eat it.
So,
And yeah, so that's one of the funny things.
what kind of product? Was that a jam?
Oh, so I remember particularly a plum jam.
Okay, okay. So that's a common thing that happens nowadays. So what people like to do is they like to try and change the recipe to make it healthier. So they would maybe make a jam, but try and reduce the sugar. So the problem with that is that your jam is actually preserved because of the high sugar content. So it's a combination of three things. It's the high sugar content, it's the acid that's naturally occurring in the jam. In most jams have quite high acid content. And then the third thing is the temperature that you apply. So in the jam making process, you go through a boiling process, which happens at quite a high temperature, which helps you to kill off the organisms that will spoil jam. So in jams, the organisms that you're trying to eliminate are yeast and mold. And generally, heating up a jam to about 90 degrees Celsius and filling it at 90 degrees Celsius would be sufficient for the jam to be stable. Now, that's only true if you left all the sugar in the jam. So a jam needs to have approximately total sugars, so it's the sugars you've added plus the natural sugars coming from the fruit. You need to have roughly about a minimum of about 60% sugar in the jam. If you don't have that level of sugar, like we discussed in part 1, you now end up with a higher water activity. So your water activity is not protecting you against this vast spectrum of organisms that can grow. So then your normal jam making process won't render a shelf-stable jam. So that was probably what your dad was experiencing when he took the sugar out of the plum jam. So if you wanted to do that, you need to make sure that the jam is still at the right pH. So if you're in doubt, like with things like fig jam, which normally has a high pH, you'd have to add lemon juice or you add citric acid to bring the pH down to below 4.50. And then if you've taken sugar out, you're now turning that into a product that needs pasteurizing. So water canning, water boiling or water bath canning. So you would have to run a process similar to like canning tomatoes, where you would hot fill it and then still put it in a water boiling process to render it shelf stable. The other problem with doing that with jams is the pectin that you are using. The pectin is a functional ingredient. The pectin is what causes your jam to set, or to give you that jam texture, that spreadability that you're looking for. Now, the way normal pectins work in normal jams is your pH needs to be in a certain range, so you need to have a certain level of acidity, and then you definitely need to have 60% or more worth of sugar inside of the jam for the pectin to work properly. And if you had to reduce the sugar, the pectin won't be as effective anymore. So you could end up with a jam that's fairly runny and won't have a good set. So you need to stick to the recipes from a trusted, verified source. If you want to make a low sugar jam, then you need to find a recipe that's been verified, and then you can follow that recipe. But to change your own recipe might be a little tricky to still end up with a shelf-stable product. Okay, so if we look just very quickly at what happened, you can see the orange line is the canner. Very quickly got up to its temperature set point that we were looking for. And the blue line is inside the container. You can see it takes a long time to heat up before it gets to the before it gets close to the canner temperature. And what we would then do, we would run calculations based on this curve to determine the lethality. So we will end up with another graph under this graph, and we'd calculate the area of that graph, and that would give us the lethality to tell us whether the process was safe or not. So this is just very briefly what happens when we're putting together a recipe for a canning process. So if you go through a government website or a home canning website, maybe from one of the universities, where they put trusted recipes for you to follow, this is the process that they would have then followed to give you that time-temperature combination. And that, in brief, is how we preserve products at home through a home canning process. Another question?
In terms of once you've opened the can, how long can you still use that product out of the can? I know they say refrigerate and
Yeah.
that type of thing.
So you would need to refrigerate it. The product is, let's call it commercially sterile. It's not entirely sterile. So what we mean by commercially sterile is anything that can cause a problem has been eliminated. Okay? So it's not to say there's zero bacteria. There might still be spores in your product, but they won't pose any harm. They won't germinate. They won't grow. So once you open the container, it's no longer commercially sterile. It's now come into contact with the air and bacteria. So that's why you need to refrigerate it after opening if you didn't use the entire contents. If you want a general rule of thumb, maybe three to 4 days after opening, that's sort of the maximum that you're looking at before you need to discard the product. But you can, once the product is opened, there's no longer any Clostridium risk. You've now opened the container. There's oxygen inside. You remember we said that Clostridium botulinum only grows in the absence of oxygen. And you remember these jars popped down. There's a vacuum. So that means there's zero oxygen inside here. So that's why it's a Clostridium risk. But once we've opened it, it's no longer a Clostridium risk. Now it's more general spoilage, yeast, mold, lactobacillus, that kind of bacteria. And with most of these bacteria, you're going to taste or smell that something's funny. But I would recommend 3 to 4 days maximum, refrigerated. Any other questions? If not, then that's all we have for today. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, one more?
Yeah, you said obviously the color and the texture of the product is going to change. Are there methods to preserve the color? I know previously you mentioned blanching. Is there any other techniques?
Okay, good question. Thank you for asking that question. So if you are worried about discoloration, so if we look at the carrots, we didn't lose too much color. It still looks fairly good. But certain green vegetables, for example, it might lose its green color. Maybe it goes brown or it goes yellow. So one thing you can do is you can add a little bit of ascorbic acid to your jar. Ascorbic acid is vitamin C. So it isn't a strange additive, it's vitamin C. And the good thing about vitamin C is it's an antioxidant. So what it will do is whatever oxygen, so the change in color is a combination of whatever oxygen was still in the container, and it's also a result of the heating process. So the vitamin C that you add will consume the oxygen because it's an antioxidant, and that will protect your product from oxidation. So you could add a little bit of vitamin C to certain products to try and prevent that. I know also with green vegetables, spinach, green beans, and so on, if you're worried about losing color, you can also blanch it in sodium bicarb, in a sodium bicarb solution, and will actually make it go bright green, so it will increase the green color. So when it goes through your canning process, you might retain more of the green color. But if you're doing home canning and you know trying to use as little additives as possible, sometimes you're going to lose some color, but most of the macronutrients are still going to be there. So it will still be quite a nutritious product. Good, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Ravano. Once again, something for us to take home and to preserve for our family. We thank you very much for giving your time. And I know we're going to have you back on some other types of preservation, so we look forward to that. And yeah, thank you very much. And to all of you out there, online or watching the videos at a later stage, remember we'll be having Brigitte Odendaal coming to us together with Bruce Webb, Dr. Bruce Webb, and that will be on the 16th and 17th of November, so diarize that. You know, when we're at home, it's an absolute must to be able to, when you're in the country, you need to be able to treat yourself for general ailments and illnesses and that sort of thing. So look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much for everyone. Thank you for the team, and God bless.